and thank you for joining me here today at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am joined once again by Preston. So Preston, thank you so much for being on Why the Book Wins.
Hello, always great to be here.
Yeah, and you are the first person that I have had on 3 times now.
All right,
So
record.
you are the most frequent guest at this point. So we did Blade Runner, which was adapted from Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And then in January, we covered I Am Legend, so I will link to both of those if people want to listen to those. And then today, do you want to introduce today's topic?
Yes, we are doing The Pale Blue Eye, written in 2003. And it was written by, is it Louis Bayard?
I think so, yeah.
Louis Bayard, written in 2003. And then the film adaptation, which came out in 2022, The Pale Blue Eye, starring Christian Bale and Harry Melling as Edgar Allan Poe.
Nice. And it was directed by Scott Cooper. And you actually recommended we cover this one. So what was it? Because you watched the movie first. So what was it that made you think this would be a good one to talk about?
So I think that I actually had watched it a couple days before we recorded I Am Legend, and I mentioned it. I think I even mentioned it in the podcast, wanting to do it. I'm a huge fan of the aesthetic of that era. I'm pretty sure I've mentioned this before with you, but I'm a huge fan of the poet Emily Dickinson, who's born in 1830, and this book takes place in December of 1830, which is, she was born December 10th, 1830. So I felt like a special connection to it. I'm a huge Edgar Allan Poe fan. I feel that both the book and the movie really capture who he was, so I would definitely like to talk about how much they honor and respect his character in both the book and the film. And then I thought the aesthetic was good. I think that Christian Bale is a great actor. I was blown away by the Harry. I keep wanting to say Harry. He was in the Harry Potter films, but his name is Harry as well. So Harry Melling, who played Dudley Dursley, and he was kind of an overweight boy. And in this, he's very thin. And I believe he's had some personal struggles and maybe some illness too that kind of led to it. But he's perfect for me as Edgar Allan Poe. So that was kind of what drew me to it. Initially, I did see the movie first, so I think that the way I experienced this story is going to be a little different from how you experienced it.
Right. And I'm glad you said you're a fan of Edgar Allan Poe, because I haven't read any of his work since like junior high or something. I've been meaning to do like The Fall of the House of Usher for an episode, but
Vincent Price.
So I feel like I know enough about him to see some of the obvious references, but I feel like someone who's a bigger fan would be able to have appreciated it so much more. So I'm glad that you are a bigger fan and you could notice those things. And so on to the book review. So I was curious what your experience was reading this book, because sometimes with mysteries, when you go into the book already having seen the movie and you know the reveal, I feel like that can either make the book experience better or worse, because some books, I think if they're not well written, it can just seem boring because you're like, the mystery isn't intriguing. I know what's going to happen, so I'm just kind of bored. So is that your experience, or did you think knowing the reveal almost made it better because you could notice all of the hints that are given all along?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I did pick up the book kind of being like, I already know what's going to happen. There is, and we'll give the spoiler warning, but there is a twist ending that I went into it being like, well, I know what's going to happen. How dynamic is the book going to be for me? And I was pleasantly surprised that it starts out in a different way than the film does. The film has a really stark beginning, and this beginning is a little more like mysterious and kind of so in a lot of interestingly enough, in a lot of Edgar Allan Poe's books, so Cask of Amontillado, or however you say that, the Telltale Heart, which is where the term The Pale Blue Eye actually comes from, is from a line in Telltale Heart. It's written in a first-person narration, and usually the first couple paragraphs is the narrator like insisting that they're not crazy and you need to listen to them. And it kind of started out a similar way where he's like, Augustus Landor is like, you know, hey, I'm dying, but I still see my wife and my friends and my old dog, and they're all dead, but I can see them just as I see you and me. And he's kind of like nutty, and he's like, but I promise you I'm not crazy, and let me explain. You know, and so that it really hooked me in. And I think the book was written dynamically enough because it's done through like a first person inside Augustus's head. And then his interactions with Poe are either dialogue driven or in notes. There's like notes back and forth. And I think that the author did a great job of keeping it. He stuck to one format enough that it didn't seem all over the place. But then when the story could have gotten a little slow, he switched the style up. And the fact that Gus and Poe were two completely different voices, that's just a lot of talent from that author.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to mention that because we get lengthy sections that are written in Poe's perspective because he's writing letters to Landor. And yeah, the difference between the writing styles I thought was so well done. Like this book almost feels like it could have been written in the 1800s because I think he just really captured the way they spoke back then.
Yeah.
So yeah, I thought this was a really well-written book. And as someone who didn't know what was going to happen, I was definitely on the edge of my seat and like wanting to know what was going to happen. And then also, I loved that so much of this book is about the friendship that forms between Landor and Poe. And so even though the mystery is like driving the story, I was surprised at just what a big role that friendship played in the book. And I just loved seeing their bond.
It was funny to me, and I know that members of your family that are huge Starsky and Hutch fans, and it was a buddy cop. In the end, it was a buddy cop story. You know, it was two friends. You know, it's unfortunately didn't have the whimsy, I suppose, that 70s cop movies do, but it was their friendship, and I would like to discuss the ending because I did get in both the film and the book, which they end a little differently. It was very emotional for me, just their relationship and what kind of happened to it. Yeah. In just skipping to kind of just mixing in Edgar Allan Poe's life, and I really like that you said it was written in the 1830s. They used very flowery language, and like I said, being familiar with the writings of Emily Dickinson too, it was very ornate language, and he captures that really well. There's nothing, it's almost like reading something like scriptures or something that like is like this higher English than what we use right now. You know, this is what it felt to me. And then I don't remember, you were born in upstate New York, right? I know you moved when you were little, but so it was kind of cool that this takes place in upstate. They call it the Highlands, but it's upstate New York. So
and
more connection.
I know we were talking about Sleepy Hollow. We were texting about that because this was definitely giving me Sleepy Hollow vibes, which obviously that's upstate New York, and it takes place like in the winter time, and it's a spooky story too. So I think if you like the vibe of Sleepy Hollow, listener, that you should also check out The Pale Blue Eye.
Yeah, I would describe it as a gothic horror, not that it's not a horror film, but the aesthetic is that. Yeah. Even the very common looks very creepy because it's kind of the Victorian era look. In the film, I loved the costuming and aesthetics. I thought that they were perfect.
Yeah. Moving on to the film, which I was surprised. So I watched this and I liked it a lot. And then I was looking on Letterboxd. I don't know if you have a Letterboxd account, but a lot of people only gave it like 2 stars. And I was like, what? Like, why did people not like this better? I was kind of confused. But I thought it was a great adaptation. And there were scenes from the book that the movie cut out. But honestly, like I don't think they did any changes that really bothered me. Because the scenes they cut, I'm like, that wasn't really necessary. So I'm fine with that being left out. So I thought it was a great adaptation.
I agree, and so it's actually when we do our decide whether the book and movie wins, other people's opinions actually kind of influenced what I think of the film, because I tend to, if someone like really doesn't like something, I look into why and decide for myself. And when I listened or read other reviews, there were a lot of people hating on the film that I don't feel like it deserved the critique that it got. And in the same, I try my best, even though we're a book and movie comparison, if it's two different forms of art. So I know, like, in Lord of the Rings, like, the whole, like, a lot of people are upset that Tom Bombadil isn't in Lord of the Rings. And it's like, that would have been cool to see, but it also doesn't ruin the film for me. So
yeah, very true. Yeah, and that's something where, like, maybe I used to think more like the movie needs to be as close to the book as possible. But I think over time I've realized, like you said, they're two different mediums. And so a movie, of course, can't include everything that's in a full-length novel. And it shouldn't try to, because if it does, it just makes the movie worse in some ways. So yeah, very good point. Unless you have any other spoiler-free thoughts, ultimately I would recommend both. I really loved both of them. So unless you have any spoiler-free thoughts, we can move on to spoilers.
Any other spoiler-free thoughts? Nothing that I don't know. I think that the spoilers would be best, or post-spoilers, the things I wanted to talk about. A little fun piece of history. Edgar Allan Poe's in real life, his last short story was titled Landor's Cottage. And in the book, I thought it was a cool, because in the book and movie, he mentions how he's going to honor their relationship in some way. And in real life, he had a story called Landor's Cottage, which Augustus Landor is the Christian Bale character.
Right. Which, in the book too, I thought, like, Landor and Poe are so different. And so I think that's part of the reason I love their friendship, is because they had so much not in common, and yet they still bonded. But there was a line in particular where he says, Landor is asking Poe something about color. And Poe says something about the color purple, but he calls it aubergine. And Landor is thinking, like, of course he can't just say purple. And how Poe just always makes things even more eloquent and flourishes things and gives long answers when he could have given a simple answer. Whereas Landor is the kind of guy who does give simple answers for the most part. So the character development was great.
And just the between the book and movie, the character of Landor, I feel like in the book he was a bit more sardonic and wry, and maybe even a little sarcastic, to the point where there's a little bit of humor. In his words. He's a lot more morose in the film. But once again, I think it works for the film.
Yeah, the book did have some comedy, whereas, the movie, I wouldn't really say that it had that. But okay, so from here on out, we will be getting into the plot of the book and movie, which means we will be getting into spoilers. So beginning with the beginning of the story. So both begin with Landor trigger warning to sexual assault. Oh, true.
As well, yes.
Yeah. But both begin with Landor being summoned to West Point for reasons that are undisclosed. And once you get there, the two men in charge of West Point, which one guy's named Hitchcock, and now I'm forgetting the other guy's name. But the two guys in charge of West Point say that there has been a murder, they say there has been a suicide. Cadet Leroy Fry has committed suicide the night before. And then after the discovery of his body, they later found that his heart was stolen. So they hire Landor to come figure out who took his heart. And then a minor difference is that in the movie, they took the heart when the body was still in the hospital, whereas in the book, they take the body, and the body is later found by the ice house.
Yes. And can we go into this the big reveal now? Okay, so Landor is, and there's a lot more connections. This is kind of a simple explanation. Augustus Landor, who was sent to investigate the murder, is the actual murderer the entire time, and we'll get into why. And he's actually initially wasn't one that stole the heart. He strangled a man and tried to make it look like a hanging. Gets interrupted, and we can go into that. But so going in with that context, that Augustus Landor, for a reason that is less menacing and more kind of a righteous indignity, is the killer the entire time. And so going into the book and on the second watch of the movie, when he's summoned by, I keep wanting to say Harris, it's not Harris, what's the... Hitchcock, pardon me. He's very standoffish at first, and he's kind of like, well, why do you want to see me? What if I decide not to come? And so it's like, to rewatch it, knowing that he is the killer, and the nuances in Christian Bale's acting of, like, it's like there's almost this relief of, like, is like, why do you want to talk to me? He's like, well, there's been a murder, we need you to figure it out. And he's like, oh, whew, okay.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
So he gets there. They make it really clear that they respect him but also don't like him. They think he's kind of rabble. And it gave me, and I promise not to relate everything back to Blade Runner, but it gave me the same feeling of, like, I need you, Deck. I need the old Blade Runner. True. In the office, and that motif of, like, this, like, retired detective that's the best at what he does, so he needs to come back.
And the people reluctantly being like, we gotta
exactly, like, guy. Gotta put up with this guy because he's good. Yeah. So it gave me that same... There's one other Blade Runner connection, and I'll save it for the end, but that's I promise you no more Blade Runner.
But also with Landor in the book, like, throughout the book, we can see that he's kind of an unreliable narrator in a way, because there's multiple times where he'll be describing a scene, and he'll say, like, we'll have the dialogue quotes, like, and then this person said this. And then Landor backtracks, and he's like, well, he may not have said that exactly, but, anyway. So he acknowledges, like, I mean... some of this is true, some isn't. But you think he's, like, an unreliable narrator you can trust in a way. And then the reveal comes and you're like, whoa, like, so he was unreliable the whole time because he was keeping something from us. So I thought that was really well done.
And you get a little bit of that in the film in the form of when they ask about his wife and his daughter, and he's like, oh, my daughter left, like, she moved away. Or even when Poe comments on, he's like, oh, see, I knew you liked poetry. And he's like, no, that was for someone else. And it turns out that he actually, it seems like he did, but it reminded him of his daughter, which we'll get into. But so he is not, at least not honest with the other characters about his past, which leads us to kind of be deceived by him as well.
Yeah, exactly. But to move along with the plot, so as he is at West Point investigating this, Edgar Allan Poe shows up because in real life he was a cadet at West Point. And he tells Landor, he's like, the man you're looking for is a poet. Because, you know, the significance of the heart and what that means. They also decide, though, that it could be either a poet or some kind of religious zealot because of, again, the symbolism that hearts have, like in the Bible and things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he says if you take away the literary moral meaning of a heart, that it's any other organ, just like a bladder. It's just muscle and blood. But he's like, a heart is something that if you steal it from someone, that has a meaning.
Exactly. Yeah. And then in the movie, Landor is thinking about the heart because, you know, the person took it and ice would preserve it. And so that's why he thinks to go to the ice house. And once he's there, he finds like signs that a ritual has been performed. Whereas in the book, he goes outside the ice house because that's where the body was found. And so he goes to the ice house. And again, like the book, he sees signs of, I mean, it's a little different. Like they have to do more like investigating to find the signs. But in both, they see that some sort of ritual was performed.
What I thought was interesting about the scene where this is explored in kind of the morgue operating theater, which I actually work in a funeral home now, so am around the dead quite a bit now. Mm-hmm. And they did a pretty decent job of like making the bodies look like what a real, so like props to the makeup and props department to that. But what I thought was interesting and we'll find out later that Dr. Marquis is hiding something as well. Yeah. And so he's showing Landor the body and he's like, okay, well the heart was taken out, but you missed this bruise on the back of his head and you missed this and and he's showing all these things. And I thought on the second watch and the read through, it was interesting to see two men actually who both had something to hide, kind of trying to out deceive each other.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah. And early on, because like we said, Landor is called to West Point because of the missing heart. So they think like he committed suicide, but then someone took his heart. But Landor is the one that proposes like, actually, I think he was killed and this wasn't suicide after all. And they also find a note in Leroy Fry's hand, which again, the doctor like somehow missed that the guy was holding a note in his hand, but it was a partial note. And they assume someone was trying to like lure Fry out of the dorms in the middle of the night so that they could kill him. And then we get this in book and movie where Landor asks Poe to figure out what the note said because like I said, it's just a partial note. And then once Poe comes up and he, again is just being very, what's the word I'm looking for?
He's a very dramatic man.
Yeah, and so he's being very dramatic and explaining how he has decided what this note must have said. When all along Landor is like, actually, you're wrong, because if you think of this and this, and then Poe is kind of deflated, being like, oh, so like you already knew what it said all along. Yeah. And like, what, you were just testing me?
Yeah.
So I like that in both book and movie. So moving on to the Marquis family. I think they pronounce it
I couldn't remember how to say it, but it is, but it's spelled Marquis, but I think they say Marquis. Yeah. Yeah,
because I was reading the book and in my mind I was saying Marquis, but then in the movie I think they say Marquis. Mm-hmm. But just so I don't feel like I'm talking a ton, do you want to talk about how Poe infiltrates with Artemis Marquis and Ballinger and meets Leah?
Yes, so that's the father. The Artemis is the son, correct?
Yeah.
They start, he starts the investigation and starts talking to the doctor, who's played by the guy who, like, whenever they need a creep in a movie, it's that same actor. I apologize to the actor, and I don't remember his name, but it's literally like anytime they need a creepy dude, they, like, call that actor.
Yeah.
But anyway, so he finds out that his son, that the doctor's son, is a student at West Point, and goes to find out that he also has a daughter who lives in the area as well.
Mm-hmm. And Poe finds out that, like, Artemis is kind of into, like, weird occult type stuff, too. And so that's why he's like, ooh, like, this was some kind of ritual, so he must have something to do with it.
Which, for that era, I know it seems kind of maybe a little more strange now, but you could actually be like a believer in science and the occult at the same time back then. And there were actually people, and you'll see this with Professor, I think in the movie they call him Professor Pepe, and in the book they call him Professor Papa, or however I don't know, but he was like he was like a professor of the occult, and he like studied the history of witches and witchcraft and thing like that. And you think of even, the religions of the time and the practices of the time, it was like very common that anything you couldn't understand probably had something to do with the occult.
Yeah.
And so that's the type of family. The family's very affluent. The mother, Mrs. Marquis, is played by Gillian Anderson, so I thought that was kind of cool to see. So Poe ends up kind of having a special relationship with Leah, but am I jumping ahead?
No, we can get to that part, yeah.
Okay. I sometimes, especially in the book, because it does jump around a little bit, I have trouble remembering what happens before. Yeah. Because sometimes it's told in retrospect, but sometimes it's actually happening real time. So I apologize. My mind wasn't making the correct connections.
That's okay. But yeah, so Poe is invited to Artemis's home because he kind of becomes friends with Artemis, and Artemis has a friend named Ballinger. Ballinger is his last name. I don't remember his first name. But yeah, Poe falls in love with Leah, and it seems that she loves him in return. And she's older, and so she's kind of, I don't know if she's considered a spinster, but she's older to be single. And we find out that it's because she has like this illness. And in both book and movie, Poe is out walking with her, and then she faints, and like she has a seizure in both, right? Like
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Poe gets to know Leah, and he kind of infiltrates. Poe is sent to infiltrate kind of their friend group, and they were to me. I kind of read Ballinger and Private Marquis as kind of the jock popular like kids. And so to imagine Poe going, and so he actually recites like a dirty poem, and they think that he's a funny guy. There is a historical accuracy to that, is that Edgar Allan Poe for his whole life was able to kind of make up poems, and during West Point they were like dirty limericks. And so when he became a writer, a lot of people that knew him were like, oh, this guy's hilarious, and they started reading it, and they're like, oh, the Raven, what, like, so it was like this like shift of like he was maybe being a bit more true to himself, where it seems like his more jovial poems were an attempt to fit in how he could. There's actually a quote I wanted to get to because I got a little emotional because I found it somewhat relatable. But so he falls in love with Leia. He tells her about his mother and how his mother speaks to him. And it turns out that she actually believes one of her ancestors is speaking to her as well. So they kind of bond over that. In that era, it was almost romantic to a degree to be kind of like this sickly, delicate woman.
Yeah.
She had that aesthetic that he found appealing, where it's like, you see a lot of the Victorian novels are like the fainting women that can't handle life, and that was, so he was drawn to that, her sickly, kind of this preoccupation with death because she had accepted she was going to die type of gothic. And when I say gothic, I don't mean like with the makeup, I mean like the old meaning of gothic style character woman.
Yeah, and also with Poe, there's a part when he's walking with Leah because it's wintertime, and he says something about how he finds wintertime to be the most beautiful because the earth is like stripped of its frills, basically, and just its bareness. He finds it the most beautiful. And then there's also a reoccurring line. They mention it in the movie, but I think they changed it a bit, where he says like, the death of a beautiful woman is like poetry's most beloved topic or something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, sickly woman in danger, obviously that's always been a popular theme.
So she actually serves as the kind of a theoretical inspiration for a character that Edgar Allan Poe references through many of his stories named Lenore.
Oh, yeah.
Which if you read in the Raven, the fair maiden that the angels named Lenore, but nameless here forevermore. And that's the whole the poem of the Raven is like his like need to be with this woman who had died. And so when you see what happens to Leah, and you kind of are able to connect like the ethereal nature of like this like love he had that he immediately lost, and like in his real writings of this woman named Lenore, they're very connected.
Yeah, interesting. And then also in the book, which you mentioned this, how the night of Leroy Fry's body being found, Poe says he woke up with like a poem in his head, and he's like, I didn't create it though. Like I was like writing it down from someone else, and he thinks it was his mother. And in the poem, it references like being lured by a pale blue eye. And then Leah is mentioned to have pale blue eyes. And then eventually we find out Landor's daughter had pale blue eyes as well. But yeah, and you said that also was a reference because in The Telltale Heart, this guy is like haunted by someone's pale blue eye. Right.
Yeah, it's a guy who had like one normal eye and one like eye like a hawk that was pale and blue.
Yeah.
And he kills him and hides him under the floorboards. And in the book, at least, we're led to believe he would have gotten away with it if he didn't hear the guy's beating heart over and over, and like the guilt takes him over, and he finally tells the police like he's under the floorboards, I killed him. And it was like they weren't even like, they were just asking like where he was, like they didn't even suspect him, and he was like, you got me.
Yeah, and so I like the heart reference too, and the pale blue eye, because obviously everybody thinks of the telltale heart when it comes to Edgar Allan Poe. But moving along with the plot, so soon after the death of Fry, it's like within the next few days, like a sheep and a cow are found killed without their hearts. And then a few days after that, Ballinger is also found dead with his heart removed, plus he is also castrated. And then shortly after Ballinger's death, a man named Stoddard goes missing, and he isn't killed, but they assumed that he ran away because he is somehow connected to all of this, and he was worried he would be next, and so he ran away.
No, and so at that point in time, I think it might, I brought the quote up because it was, to me, it was a really powerful thing to say. But so he infiltrates the friend group, Poe does, and then kind of blows it because he's a big talker, and they go into how he's not a very, like, necessarily a guy that's taken very seriously, even at the school. Like, I really like the scene where he's doing, like, he's out and he's running all weird, and I'm like, what's he doing? And then he goes to the doctor and he's like, I can't do PE today, like, as you can see, I have a heart flutter. And they're like, they were just kind of like, fine, whatever, Poe, like, you're a weirdo, like, you know, like, so I really liked that. But so Landor actually gets mad because you see the whole like, oh, well, it was a poet, and you're like, at first, on first watch, before I knew the end, you're like, well, did Poe do it? Are they going to implicate Poe?
Yeah.
And there's some other things happen where
Poe lied because he said that he never had negative interactions with Fry or Ballinger, but then Landor finds out that he did have negative, like, arguments with both of them, and he's like, why are you keeping this from me? Like you had confrontations with both of them, like you could have been the killer. That's
exactly the scene that I wanted to talk about. I'm glad that you brought that up, because you find out that he had actually like threatened to kill, like and it was in a very poetic way, but he had kind of like a backhanded threat, like it wasn't a direct thing, but he's like, oh, if they're messing with me, I'll kill him. And I understand from someone, and even times in my life where I wasn't as confident of a person, where you talk big to kind of puff yourself up, and how it's like any attempt to make yourself less weird only makes you look more weird. And I thought that was like I could totally imagine Poe being that type of a person. And I thought this was so very well written. So this is Poe speaking about that, where Landor says, there's a very disturbing pattern here, Mr. Poe. Men who cross you end up on the wrong end of a noose with rather important organs carved away from their chests. And Poe replies, Mr. Landor, if I were to kill every cadet who had abused me during my brief tenure here, I'm afraid you would find the corps of cadets reduced to less than a dozen. Now, if you must know, I have been a figure of fun from my very first day here. My manner, my age, my person, my aesthetic. If I had 1,000 lifetimes, I could not begin to address all the injuries that have been done to me. Yes, I am guilty of a great many things, but never murder. Now, do you believe me? I liked that statement as like, just because you're a strange person or you don't fit in, it doesn't make you automatically bad.
Yeah.
And I think that movies in general are getting better about that, where it's like, you know, you think of a lot of movies, and even classic movies, the bad guy's like almost always mentally ill in some way, you know. And now it's like Poe, if you look at it, is really the only innocent hero in the story. Everyone else really has something to hide, other than Edgar Allan Poe, other than his kind of big talk and being a little strange. It reminded me, there's a scene, did you ever see the movie Jewel, about the Olympics bombing? Clint Eastwood directed it.
Oh, no, I wanted to see that, but yeah, I never did.
So it's based on a true story, and the guy's kind of a wannabe cop, and he's kind of weird, and there's a bombing at the Atlanta Olympics, which really happened. He's trying his best to help, and it only makes him look more and more guilty. And this guy's, in real life, his life was ruined because people were like, well, he's a weird dude, he obviously did it. And there's a scene in that actually mirrors that scene as well, where he's like, I know I'm overweight, I know I'm not very smart, I know, he's like, I just want to be taken seriously. And it's like, I love, and in a lot of ways kind of internalize that, to be honest with you, of this, like, the person who doesn't fit in trying their best to do what's right, and it's still to the general populace, they're not taken seriously or not understood. And they're still discriminated against based on like appearances or just being a little off in one way or another. Yeah, or not processing thing in their brain. Because even Poe, like, he could have just said like, hey, the guy who carved out the heart obviously had an artistic thing, but he was like, he is a poet, so, you know, and he like gets all like weird about it, you know, like...
And I think that's why a lot of people liked him and still like him too, is because, which I'm not like an English literary major, so I don't really, I'm not saying this because I have the knowledge of it, but I feel like he was writing something different potentially, and people at the time and even now were like, oh, like he's kind of weird and he's too out there. But then that's that same reason why people do like him though, is because he is kind of weird and he is different and he speaks to, you know, that side of people.
Yeah, people more comfortable with the dark or the macabre. The other thing that's interesting about Poe is, to be completely honest, there was a lot of strange things in his life. I tried to look at it through the lens of the 1830s, but he was married to his cousin, and it was kind of a marriage of convenience, and a lot of people now think that it might have been kind of more of like an open marriage situation where he married his cousin to keep her safe, and then like, because he didn't try to hide any of like the affairs he was having in his life, and his wife never really did anything about it and was never particularly bothered. And so back then that was really scandalous, but like it seemed like that's what most people believe was probably the arrangement now. His eulogy was actually written by someone who did not like him. So like that motif of, oh, he died a drunk and no one liked him and stuff, like literally someone who didn't like him wrote his eulogy. So it's like, if you can imagine someone that you don't get along with writing your eulogy, I can't imagine anything nice being said. So it's
Right.
like,
I read that too. Yeah, where like so many things that we assume are true about him were written by some guy who was purposefully trying to slander his name now that he was dead. So I had no idea. So that was interesting.
So it's hard to see, and like I said, there are definitely some strange things about his life in practice, but also he made no bones about the fact he was a strange dude. So like, you know.
Yeah, very true. So with this book and movie, like moving on to like the climax, which there's like two climactic moments, because there's one reveal that happens and it makes it seem like, oh, like that's it, that's the ending. But then when I read that in the book, I was like, what? It seems like this is coming to an end, but I still like have quite a bit left to read. And it's because then there's like another reveal that happens. So moving to like the first climactic moment. So Landor and Poe go see one of Landor's friends, who you mentioned. He was like a professor, which this was funny in the book because this guy, Landor doesn't know him well enough to just pop in. So he lets him know beforehand. And when they show up, he is like purposefully trying to be weird and outlandish. And then later, Landor goes unannounced, and the guy's just totally normal, being like, oh, wait, I wasn't prepared.
Yeah. I thought that was funny. Very eccentric character. Played by Robert Duvall in the film, I believe. I don't know why they changed it from Pepe to Popeye. That seemed like a weird aesthetic choice.
Yeah, he was also like part Native American or part Native American in the book too. So that was like part of his character. But he tells them because initially, like we said, they think it's part of a ritual. And so they go to him to like learn about different rituals. And he tells them about this guy named Henry Leclerc, who like had famously killed over 600 witches or something. And then he kind of, switched over to the dark side himself before dying. And partway through the book and movie, Landor realizes, like, wait a minute, like, I saw that guy's portrait in the Marquis home. And so we realize, like you said, Leah, like, has a communication with an ancestor, and it is Henry Leclerc. And so Landor, when he has this realization, he goes to the Marquis home and he talks to the doctor, or the father, and the father confesses, like, yes, Leah has this disease, and then she started, like, speaking to this ancestor. And then he started helping her and she started getting better. So whatever he was having her do, like it worked. So can you blame us for just going along with it? And so like the spirit of Leclerc would kind of have them do these rituals, which involve the hearts. But our Artemis and Leah promised the father, like, we would never kill anyone though.
Yeah, so they referenced, I think, the witch's feast, and it was like dining on the heart of a hanged man will prolong your life. And they said, well, the dad's like, well, I can't condone you guys murdering people. And then turns out they were able to find a dead body, and the dad was like, hey, there's a dead body here.
Yeah.
Come get the heart.
Yeah. And so as this reveal is happening with Landor and the doctor, suddenly Landor realizes, like, wait a minute, like, where's Poe? Where's your children? Like, I saw Poe's jacket, but he's not here. So where is he? And so this is a moment I was expecting to happen. Like, as I was reading the book, I expected there to be some huge moment where Poe is going to be the victim and Landor has to rush in and save him. And that is what happens in book and movie, where like they are draining his blood and they're in the ice house. I think in both. Yeah. In the book, they're like in an underground area of the ice house where this is happening. And they have
above
a fire
the blocks.
going.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically they're going to do this ceremony with Poe, but Landor interrupts it. And long story short, Leah and Artemis both die, but Mrs. Marquis lives. and she and Landor get out of there. But yeah, Leah's death is different from book to movie a bit, because in the movie she's just like hit with a beam because they have this fire going, and so the building starts to crash down and a beam hits her. Whereas in the book, it's like kind of weird, where like she has Fry's heart and she tries to eat it and she chokes and then she dies. So it was like kind of funny. I don't know if it was meant to be funny, but it was just like, so like, oh my goodness.
Yeah, unnecessarily graphic isn't the word, but he got really descriptive with the deaths, which he hadn't previous to anyone else had died, and it was just like, it was almost like he was like the author was trying to like give the climax
stakes.
more impact, and I mean, because the other deaths were just as grisly, but he wasn't as like over the top descriptive. I actually, on my second rewatch of the film, like I tried to figure out, because like, and maybe I must have missed some of the dialogue, because she kind of goes from her conversation, Poe tells her the poem, and she's like, well, would you do anything for me because I love you? And then he says yes, and then I was like, well, how did they get him on the table, like all kind of out of it? Like, did they drug him or whatever? But it seems like they maybe had told him it was just going to be like a bloodletting, because she takes the blood and like puts it on her face and on her chest and on his chest. And then he kind of starts protesting, where he's like, oh, but I thought, and he's kind of like all like woozy and stuff. So, because at first I was like that didn't seem like, as strange as Poe was, I don't think that he would just willingly let himself be killed. Yeah. But then I realized, I think it was more she had deceived him, that it was just going to be some sort of ritual. And then at the end, she's like, don't you understand the ultimate test of love is death? And he's kind of too out of it to even realize what's going on fully, I think. Something that wasn't in the movie was, prior to this, Poe tells Landor that one night he was like walking into his dorm, and then Artemis shows up and is like talking to Poe, and in some ways it almost seems like is Artemis making a pass at Poe, but he also asks Poe, being like, oh, like, you've never known the touch of a person before, have you? Meaning that he's a virgin, and obviously virgins are a big part of rituals, and so that also clues Landor into being like, wait a minute, that was why he was asking. So they escape, and Poe ends up being fine, like he lost some blood, but the doctor jokes, or maybe not jokes, but he's like, hey, maybe it did him some good, because that was the thing they did. I thought that was
then.
funny too. Yeah. Because Hitchcock says that in the film. Yeah, in the book I think a doctor says it. Which, the guy who played Hitchcock, he was in Carnival Row, and I hated his character in Carnival Row, and he didn't do a good job. Like, part of it was the acting. I didn't think it was good. But in this film, he does a really good job, so maybe, I don't know, maybe he was having an off day or something. Yeah.
Maybe this director was able to get a better performance out of him or something. Yeah,
that very well could be. It's funny that it's set in America, and most of the characters are from the UK.
Yeah, that's so true. It is funny, like the movie Little Women, it's like set in America, obviously, but like all of the characters who play the four sisters, they're all like from different countries. So that is kind of funny. But and so it seems in book and movie like, oh, like, so that's the mystery. That was
They were the killers. Mystery solved. Yeah.
And even though, as I was reading the book, I knew there was more left to it, but even so, I wasn't suspecting the next reveal. And so I thought that was the mystery and that was it. And I was kind of disappointed, because I was like, what? Like, that's so predictable. Like, I could have sworn, I would have bet that wouldn't be the answer, because it just seemed too obvious as we were reading. And so I felt kind of disappointed. But then that all changed when then the final reveal happened, which... Do you want to share how Poe comes to Landor's cottage and Poe realizes the true killer?
Absolutely. So, and to that point that you just said, it wrapped up so nicely that it did feel like a cop-out at first, which I think is brilliant writing, where it's like, you're given this false ending where you kind of are, he intentionally made me go, oh, come on, and so then, so you think everything's fine, you think it's going to be like a somewhat happy ending, more or less, that all the loose ends were tied up, and so Poe comes to Landor's cottage, obviously very upset, and he kind of like, he doesn't know what to do with himself, and he's walking around and he has his hands above his head, and he's like, and one of the first things he said that I thought was like so heartbreaking is that he's like, if you would have just told me what happened, like, I could have been a friend to you as much as you were a friend to me. And that really got me going, where it's like, knowing that, and what he had figured out is that Landor was the killer, and I'll explain a little more, but even knowing that, Poe was like, hey, you were like my friend when no one else would be, and I would have been your friend back. Like, even if you had just been honest with me, like, right off the bat, I would have helped you. So what it turns out is that Augustus Landor's daughter didn't run away. She had gone to the West Point ball, which was kind of like a prom style party, and on her way back, so 3 cadets had actually raped her, and in the movie it's portrayed fairly graphically. It was a very unsettling scene, and it turned out to be the 2 that ended up murdered, and the one that ran away were the 3 men who had done it. It's kind of, as they're talking, it's shown in flashbacks, and she has, she's obviously very affected and very hurt. He opens up her hand as he's cleaning his daughter up, as Landor's cleaning his daughter up, and finds the dog tags with the initials of
Fry.
Of Fry, yeah. I thought that the flip-flop symbology was interesting, or symbolism was interesting. She's that scene where she's like praying to that picture of Jesus, and she's like, just like, you can't even understand what she's saying. She's like, and he's like, he can't help you, but I can help you. And he's like telling his daughter, like, let me help you. And I thought it was an interesting, reversal of the doctor and his daughter, where he was a man of science, and he's like, hey, science can't help you, so turn to the occult. That's okay, I'll do anything. And with them, it's like, hey, the religion or spirituality can't help you, but I can. I'll find these men. So I thought it was interesting that it was both the doctor and his daughter, and Landor and Landor's daughter, there was a similar relationship and similar motivations to both men. I never even
thought of that.
And so she ends up just kind of nothing she's saying makes sense. He's trying everything to help her. And at the very end, she cleans up and she bathes and she combs her hair and she goes out to a cliff in the Highlands and he follows her. And this is some brilliant acting on Christian Bale's part. Definitely evoked a reaction from me as well. But he's like, come back, I'll make it right. And then she repeats when she comes home and falls into his arms after she had been assaulted, she says everything will work out in the end, because that's what he told her.
Yeah.
And then she tells him she loves him, and she jumps off the cliff to her death. And so that kind of makes him go into a fury kill mode. He hangs the Fry and is interrupted by another cadet who's out on watch. And another thing I really liked is how appropriately dark in terms of lighting the film was. I think sometimes when we watch movies in the old times, things are fully lit.
Yeah.
And it's no, it's going to be dark. And so some of the things, there was well, I thought I saw this, but maybe it wasn't that. I don't know, it was dark. So if you only have a lantern or a candle, you're not going to be able to. So I thought that was really well done, is that he saw struggling and Landor ran off, and because it even says, the witness says the guy wasn't hanged like a man usually hangs himself. He was sitting in a chair. It was because Landor had pulled the rope and was strangling him to death. It wasn't an actual jump off something hanging. So he hunts him down, just happens to be put on the case, which gives him the opportunity to both corrupt the case and kind of tailor it to what he wanted people to believe, to hide things, and also to hunt down the other killers.
Yeah, I forgot to mention this, but he finds out that Ballinger and Stoddard were the other 2 because someone finds Lefray. I keep wanting to call him Lefray, but someone finds Leroy Fry's diary, and so they give it to Landor to decode, and while he's decoding the diary, he finds that information out, and that's how he finds out who the other 2 are.
Yes. So he killed the 2, and then I thought it was interesting because Poe even says, are you going to go after the 3rd guy that ran away? And he said no, because he's sometimes living your life, having to look over your shoulder your whole life is more terrible than dying.
Yeah.
So he had gotten his revenge and he was fine. Poe was obviously really upset with that revelation that he had been the killer that put things in place, and Poe was well, and the animals. I thought this was interesting too, because it was still that kind of there was this fatherly relationship to him, where in the movie he's and the animals, Landor's of course that was me.
Yeah.
And so they figure it out, and the way that Poe initially figured out is that Landor had written him a note that said meet me in the courtyard, take courage, and the letter T was the same shape.
Yeah.
It was the same handwriting shape, which I thought it was interesting. We didn't mention her, but there's a prostitute named Patty or Patsy.
Oh yeah, and
Patsy
she actually also tells Poe.
She tells Poe, and it seems like both Landor and Fry both had some sort of relationship with her.
Yeah.
Landor out of loneliness, and Fry because he seemed kind of deviant. But he's actually calling to her. I thought it was interesting that when Fry is out right before he gets hanged, he's like, Patsy. So Landor actually figured it out from the lady they were both sleeping with. Figured out where he would be and how to lure him.
Yeah.
So I thought she was an interesting device as a character. So Poe goes, I have all of this evidence against you. He's I could put you away right now. And Landor hands him a note with his confession on it, and he's not making I actually did like this in the movie better than the book. In the book, he's pointing a gun at him, and Poe's like, that gun's not loaded, and he's like, yeah, it is, and they're like having this back and forth of like, Poe's like, you're not gonna kill me, we're friends, and it's obvious he's not going to, but he has a gun. I liked the motif of just someone who was tired and done, where he had like, he wasn't malicious, he wasn't a killer per se, he was tried to be a good guy his whole life, but his daughter being hurt put him over the edge. But once that was out of his system, and once the people who had paid for it were done, he didn't keep being a bad guy.
Yeah.
You know, he wasn't like, I like killing, you know.
Yeah.
So I liked that, and he says something that, and this is my other Blade Runner, he says like, he's like, you know, this ruined your reputation, and Augustus Landor is like, we're all gonna be forgotten, like, just like everyone. And I was like, in my mind, I was like tears in the rain. Like, so he hands him the signed confession. You think he's gonna leave with it, and he turns to a candle, and he burns the confession. Landor starts crying.
Yeah.
And then he turns to leave. Poe turns to leave, and Landor says, you know, like, ever since I met you, I wish that you had been the man that my daughter met on the bridge. And the part that really got to me was when he says, because who knows, maybe then we could have been a family.
Yeah.
And that was the closest he ever got to being like, hey, man, I like see you as the son I never had.
Yeah.
And I love you. You know, obviously you didn't say things like that back then, but just wishing that he was his son was
and
really
also
sad.
Because he could see that he was someone that Maddie could have gotten along with and loved too, and just like
and
the
that Poe was a
similarities the two of them
gentleman
had
and
had.
Yeah, and that Poe wouldn't have hurt her. And I'm trying to find it in the book. And because the last words of the book and the movie are the same for Poe. It says, with heavy cadenced steps, he gathered his cloak, still with its torn shoulder, and made his way to the door. He turned and looked one last time at me, with my useless pistol hanging at my side. He said, I shall treasure, but he couldn't finish his sentence. Stuck for words, the silver-tongued Poe. All he said in the end was, goodbye, Landor. And that was the same, where he was like, Poe was about to tell him, like, yeah, like, you were the friend that I had always wanted.
And a father figure, because Poe, didn't really have parents.
His parents were actually actors in real life in Boston, and they moved to Baltimore and died shortly after. And I guess his parents, when they were living, were such like impressive people that Poe as a child just kind of got swished to the side, because it was like, oh, the cool Poe actors, and there's a son who's not good for anything. Like, so yeah, he didn't really have a healthy bond with his own parents in real life.
And a part in the book that was not in the movie was like, he mentions that his mom was an actress, but in the book Landor is like, oh, like I saw her perform once. And so they have this touching moment where Landor is able to tell Poe about his own mother, and basically Poe says something about how, like, you know, it was destiny and it was meant to be for Landor to see his mother perform, so that years later he would meet the son and be able to share that memory with him. And so I thought that was a beautiful moment.
Yeah.
And the part in the book when Landor says to Poe, you know, the part where it's like, then maybe we could have been a family if you had met her. It was such a great part in the book. And then, the movie totally nailed it. And it was a great scene. So well done.
Yeah.
And the acting on both ends, so good.
Well, and just that regret of, like, you know, you can't change what happened, but like, like, it implies so much. Not only could they have kept being friends, his daughter would still be alive, might have had a chance of being happy, and just like, there's so much heaviness to that one statement.
Yeah.
And then, well, so then that's how the book kind of ends. There is an epilogue, but in the film, he goes back to the cliff where his daughter had jumped and has her hair ribbon, and he lets it go in the wind and says, goodbye, my love. And that's the end of so there's that additional little scene, which, what do you think? Do you think he jumped, or do you think that he just let go, or?
I mean, I could have been influenced by the book, because in the end of the book, which he talks about how he sees ghosts in his house, but he doesn't imply that he's debating suicide in the book, does he? I don't remember that.
In the first part of the book, he says, I'll be dead within 3 hours.
Oh, so
it
he
is.
I guess.
Last Testament of Gus Landor. In 2 to 3 hours, well, it's hard for me to tell. In 3 hours, surely, or at the very outside 4. Here, it's like his like, I don't know. Within 4 hours, let me say, I will be dead.
Yeah.
So,
and I guess in the book, did you say that's in the beginning of the book?
That's in the beginning of the book.
Yeah, so you could wonder, like, if by the time he's done writing about this experience, like, will he have a change of heart and be like, you know what, maybe life is worth living, kind of a thing. But
out of my system. Yeah.
But I do like the ambiguity with both book and movie, right? Because, in the movie, it's like, did he jump? Did he not? I don't know. I'd like to think that he didn't personally,
Same.
but
Yeah, same. And I think even they asked the director, and the director said that if he had to choose, he would say that it was him actually like returning to the spot of a traumatic death and like learning to let go, more so than like joining his daughter in death.
right. And also something that is not in the movie is that I think in the epilogue you mentioned, Landor receives a newspaper clipping from Poe. Poe doesn't say it's from him, but he just knows it's from Poe. And in the newspaper clipping, it says that Stoddard was found dead, and they think that he hung himself. But Landor is like, oh, like, was it Poe or like was it actually Stoddard? So Stoddard does end up dying in the end of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were some other like random things that the movie left out that we can just kind of touch on. For example, when Landor is at the Marquis home, like Poe is there and a lot of people are there, and they're at dinner, and the mom makes a comment to Landor being like, oh, you'd be such a great match for Leah. And it's in front of Poe, and so it's this awkward moment where it's like she's clearly dating Poe, and now you're trying to set her up with this other guy. But then also later that evening, Landor goes upstairs, and I thought this scene was kind of weird the way it was written, but he like finds a closet that is like deeper than it looks, and then once he's in there, he has like a sword fight through the clothes with someone, but he's not sure who it is.
Yeah, and that was one of the critiques. Someone was like, when I read the initial reviews of the movie, someone said that, like, oh, they left out like the saber fight in the closet, and I'm like, yeah, they did.
Yeah, big deal.
Like, yeah, I mean, it was fine in the book. It wasn't a bad scene, but it wasn't like, you're correct in that it, other than like add to the sense of danger, it didn't really, which you almost need more in a book than you do in a movie. Like the movie, the atmosphere was dangerous all the time.
True.
You don't always, you need devices like that in a novel to remind the reader, like, hey, like, he's onto something that he shouldn't be onto.
Yeah. And there was also a part in the book. So in the book, Landor approaches Hitchcock and the other guy asking like, hey, I want Poe to like be my assistant. Whereas in the movie, he just kind of asks Poe to be his assistant without asking them first. But in the book, it comes to the point where they tell him like, you need to stop using Poe, like it's putting his life in danger and you shouldn't do this. And so then Landor, like he and Poe would meet up every night and just talk, but then he starts locking his door so Poe can't come. And then he also has a moment where he's mean to Poe and he says mean things about Poe's mom and things. But one of the reasons he does it, it makes it seem later on in the book that he was saying those things so that Poe would almost feel more emotionally distant from Landor and be more open to realizing the truth about him.
It's the same as in like the movies about like a girl and a horse where they're like, get out of here, you stupid animal. I never loved you. You know, it's like the
we
same.
We don't want
like,
you anymore. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, also at the end, when Poe realizes the truth in the book, Landor gives Poe the gun, being like, well, will you just shoot me? Because if you turn me in, being hung is like a very slow death. And Poe is like, no, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
So that was another thing. Oh, and then also when Leah dies, like she dies, but then in the book, it makes it seem like she rises from the rubble in some final moment. Do you remember that part? It was kind of weird.
I think that it was kind of a nod. So there's like little teeny, in the book and the movie, are little teeny hints to other stories by Edgar Allan Poe. And so it's kind of like gives you that imagination of like all of Poe's stories are things he saw in real life, but then because he's a very flowery guy, he just made them into these big stories. And that reminded me of the fall of the House of Usher, where, you know, the sister's dead and then rises up and they see her and then the whole building topples down. So that was what I got from that, was him trying to kind of shoehorn that reference into it.
Okay, that makes more sense. Because as I was reading that part, I was like, wait, what? And then like it doesn't factor into the rest of the story. It just kind of randomly happens. But that makes sense.
Yeah. And it's interesting when talking about that, I realized that both Landor and Poe witnessed someone they loved like die right in front of them. And so they had that in common too.
True. And then we can get to book versus movie, unless you have any other thoughts.
I think we covered everything. I feel like every time we do these, like after we're done recording, I think of like 5 other things I wanted to talk about. But no, I think we covered it pretty well. Yeah, let's go for it. So
when it comes to book versus movie, do you know yet which one you prefer? Which one wins? Does the book win?
I did. Honestly, I really struggled with this one more so than the other ones we've done. Blade Runner, just because of personal association, I said movie. I Am Legend, I said book, based solely on how powerful the ending was.
Yeah.
You know, like it was good. Like the book is good, but the book won for that one. So I'm 1-1. So if I'm allowed to tie on this one, But if I had to choose, I would probably say movie, only because the movie got hate that it didn't deserve.
Yeah.
And so I feel like I need to stick up for them.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. But the book was brilliantly, I think the book's strength was in the dynamics of its writing and the understanding and respect of Edgar Allan Poe. So the book is written better, but the movie I enjoyed more overall. But I also will, my personal bias is I also saw the movie first, so I went into the book knowing the ends, which it still was a great read, and it was fun to look for all the little clues. But yeah, I'm going to say movie.
Yeah. Again, like same, because this was a tough one for me too. And like I said, the scenes that the movie did not include, I was fine with that because the book, it is pretty long. It's like over 400 pages. And some of the scenes that the movie did include, there's also a scene where like Landor goes to the party of some governor and then Poe is there with Leah, but he's pretending to be someone else. And they're like, oh, just play along with our joke.
Yeah.
And while he's dressed up as someone else, he's being like, oh, there's this American writer named Poe. Maybe you've heard of him. He's going to be the next big thing.
Yeah. And they kind of combined elements from both of those scenes in the dinner party at the Marquis' house.
Yeah. So yeah, ultimately the way they condensed things and the scenes they removed, I was totally fine with because the book, I never got bored, but like in retrospect, I'm like, yeah, that scene probably wasn't like necessary. But then I did love the focus on Landor and Poe in the book, and we just get so many scenes of the two of them like talking and connecting, and I loved those parts. But then Christian Bale and Harry Melling did such a great job portraying both of those characters, and even if we don't get as many scenes with the two of them, they still just had great chemistry, right? So you still just felt that bond.
Yeah.
So I guess, I mean, part of me too, the fact that you still enjoyed the book when you already knew the reveal, like that shows, again, just how well written the book is. So I'm tempted to say maybe the book wins for me.
Okay.
But by saying that, it's still a close call, though, because
yeah, it's super close for me too. And this is me getting as nitpicky as possible. The book sometimes, and this was just an attention thing for me, sometimes I had to take a break because it's so verbose, and I don't mean it's verbose in a bad way. It's just the language is so flowery that my head goes like a little like, okay, I need to listen to something normal. So that's not even a critique of the book so much as a critique of my attention span, I guess. I'm trying to like get like as deep into it as possible and find a reason to justify one over the other. But I think they're both great. Yeah, so,
it is really tough.
Yeah.
So ultimately, we would each recommend both at the end of the day.
Correct.
So yeah, this was such a great recommendation. So I'm glad you requested it, which Peter, my brother, your brother-in-law, he also recommended this movie. So it had been on my radar. But then when you mentioned wanting to do an episode, it just gave me all the more reason to watch it and read the book. So yeah.
Excellent. Cool.
It makes me want to read more by Edgar Allan Poe. So maybe if I do The Fall of the House of Usher or something, you could come back on. We could talk about that.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to.
Yeah. So thank you all for watching and listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube. If you're listening to this as a podcast, I would love to get a rating and review. On Spotify, you can give a star rating. On Apple, you can give a written review as well as a star rating, so that would mean a lot. And yeah, check out the other episodes I've done with Preston. I think they've all turned out great, and we always have a great conversation, so you should definitely listen to them. And thank you again to Preston for coming on the show.
Thank you very much. Always great.
Yeah, and we will see you next time. Bye.